All right, welcome to The Explainer. Today we're diving into a scholarly analysis that, frankly, challenges the very foundation of what many people understand as modern Christianity. What if the original message of the New Testament wasn't about getting your soul to heaven, but about something, well, something much more immediate and physical?
I mean, wow. That is a provocative way to start, isn't it? But it really frames our whole investigation perfectly. It forces us to ask, what if the earliest Christian writings were pointing to a reality that's been almost completely lost or just misinterpreted over the centuries?
So where does this idea come from? Well, this whole explainer is based on the deep academic work of Dr. Donald Weiss and Dr. Jeffrey Taylor. Their big argument is that, after centuries and centuries of reinterpretation, we might have completely lost the plot on what the New Testament was originally trying to say. So let's dig into their findings.
Okay, so here's how we're going to break this all down. First up, we'll introduce this core idea of a different New Testament. Then we'll deconstruct a massive one, the whole concept of soul versus body. From there, we'll try to reconstruct the original vision of the coming earthly kingdom. Then, and this part is so important, we'll be unscrambling the timeline. After that, we'll look at a major historical moment, the crisis of delay. And we'll end with the unanswered question that all of this leaves us with.
Let's start with the central claim. And for a lot of people, this is pretty astonishing. The idea is that the New Testament, as it was originally understood, describes a reality that is totally different from the one commonly taught as Christianity today. It's pretty common to contrast Jesus and Paul, to put them in different camps, but this analysis argues that no, they were actually operating from the same fundamental worldview. Despite their different roles, their entire understanding of reality was built around one single unifying concept, the kingdom of God.
Okay, so if that concept of the kingdom is so central, what's the biggest misconception that comes from not getting it right? According to this research, it starts with the most basic question of all. What happens after we die? Think about it. That image we all have in our heads, a little cartoon spirit sprouting wings, playing a harp on a cloud, it's deeply ingrained in our culture. But here's the thing. This idea of a non-material, immortal soul that just separates from the body, that's not from the New Testament. It's actually rooted in Greek philosophy, especially from Plato, and was later reinforced way down the line by thinkers like René Descartes with his whole ghost in the machine idea.
And this is where you can see these two worldviews just clash. The Greek Platonic view says your body and spirit are two separate things, but the New Testament view sees a person as a totally integrated whole. So the ultimate hope wasn't for a disembodied soul to escape the physical world. No, it was for a future bodily resurrection, an idea Paul goes on and on about in 1 Corinthians, all happening within a transformed physical earth.
So if the big promise wasn't a one-way ticket for your soul to a heavenly realm, then what in the world was this kingdom of God that was so central to both Jesus and Paul? This is the absolute crucial point. The kingdom of God wasn't understood as a place you go to, but as a tangible physical transformation of this world. The expectation was that planet Earth itself was about to enter a whole new era, an evolutionary step for humanity that would be as dramatic as, say, the very first appearance of life.
And to illustrate this, the metaphor they used all the time was pregnancy. This is brilliant. The kingdom wasn't just some future event. It was seen as something that was already here, growing and developing within the present world, like a gestating child. And in this framework, Jesus was the first fruits of this new humanity, the beginning of the transformation, not the end of it.
Okay, so you might be wondering, if this was the original vision, how did it get so obscured? To understand that, we have to look at the timeline of how the New Testament was actually written, because the order of the books in the Bible is not the order in which they were written, and this detail, it is key to the entire argument.
This is a critical point that so many people miss. The Gospels, which tell the life story of Jesus, they appear first in the New Testament, but they were not the first documents written. The earliest Christian writings we have, by a long shot, are the letters from the Apostle Paul.
This timeline really clarifies things. Jesus' life is around 30 AD, but it's not until the 50s AD that Paul is writing his letters. Mark, the author of the very first gospel, doesn't write his account until maybe 15 or 20 years later. Then Matthew, Luke, and John follow even later. What this shows is that Paul's theological framework was already established and super influential for decades before the narrative Gospels were even written.
And this wasn't some distant influence. We're talking about direct contact. Key figures like Mark, who wrote the first gospel, and Luke, who wrote a gospel in the book of Acts, were literally companions of Paul. They traveled with him, were part of his inner circle, and they knew his theology inside and out. So the gospels they eventually wrote were a synthesis, combining early traditions about Jesus with the powerful theological framework that Paul had already built. So when you take this understanding of an imminent earthly kingdom and you combine it with the actual timeline of the writings, you run headfirst into a central historical problem for the early Christian movement. I mean, it's the obvious question, right? If this whole thing was a physical transformation of the planet, when was it supposed to happen? Because both Jesus and Paul talked about it with this profound sense of urgency. It wasn't presented as some distant, abstract hope, but as something that was right on the cusp of happening. And the texts, when you read them in their historical context, they're pretty clear. The expectation was for an imminent event. They believed this material transformation of the world would happen very soon, in realistic human terms. They were not thinking about a 2,000-year delay. So what happens when it doesn't arrive? It creates a theological crisis. You can actually see the trouble brewing in Paul's letters, with believers getting restless and asking, when is this going to happen? But the crisis exploded after the absolute calamity of 70 AD, when the Roman army destroyed the temple in Jerusalem. This unfulfilled expectation forced a deep reinterpretation of the core message, and over decades and centuries, the focus had to shift away from a coming earthly kingdom and towards a timeless spiritual salvation for the individual soul. This historical reality, this crisis of delay, it leaves us with a really difficult and profound question. A question that, according to this analysis, any honest reader of the New Testament has to confront. And it's important to note the texts themselves actually contain an acknowledgement of this deep uncertainty. Even as he spoke of the kingdom's imminent arrival, Jesus himself is recorded as saying that the exact timing was unknown to anyone but God. And so we arrive at the final question. If the central prediction of an imminent physical transformation was, in human terms, incorrect, what does that imply for the rest of the message? Does the failure of a specific timeline prediction just negate the entire philosophical and theological engine that drove it? This is the core challenge that this academic analysis leaves us all to ponder.